Saddam Hussein actually went to his advisors, you write, to ask if he had weapons of mass destruction that he didn't know about. That happened?
It did happen. In a meeting in October of 2002, Saddam had a meeting of his Revolutionary Command Council, which is sort of like a cabinet-level meeting where all his people sit around the table and he holds forth at one end. And at this point in time, the British and the American intelligence organizations and politicians have been, making a public case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. There was a bit about, the Brits had said that they could launch chemical weapons within 45 minutes. And so Saddam addresses his assembled minions and says, hey, these guys in Washington and London seem to be pretty convinced that we've got these stocks. And he looks around his people and says, well, there's nothing here that you aren't telling me, guys. And these bobbleheads around him all shake their heads and no, boss, that would be impossible. But there was so much that
this is because President Bush and everyone else were so insistent publicly that he had weapons of mass destruction. He maybe thought he had ones that he didn't even know about.
That was one of the weaknesses of the way he operated. He could not fully trust the information which was presented to him. What I try to do in this book is really reflect, not just the American and the United Nations perspective, but try to bring the reader the perspective of Baghdad, of how they saw the world, and that's a side that we too often, ignore in Washington.
So here's another tidbit from the book that'll let you expound on that, I think. And this one's amazing, and it goes back to the Clinton years. Iraqi officials actually approached the Clinton administration about setting up a line of communication to collaborate on counterterrorism, Israel-Palestine, and going after the 1993 World Trade Center bombers, and the Clinton White House didn't respond. Do I have that right?
That is correct, and this is in many ways a classic tragedy between Iraq and the Western world, and Washington in particular. Baghdad did not fully understand Washington, and Washington did not fully understand Baghdad. Baghdad, and Saddam in particular, thought that it was natural that the United States would recognize that Iraq was a natural ally or friend in the region. Iraq was secular, westward-leaning, basically, or great engineers and resources, of course, with their oil reserves. After the Kuwait War, over time, the Saddam regime thought, well, the Americans, must come to a realization that we are their natural ally. And Saddam, who derived a lot of prestige in the region by being the guy standing up to the last superpower, along the lines that your prestige is associated with the size of your enemy. He was the guy who was standing up to the last superpower. By the same token, he could equally receive prestige by being aligned with the United States. So he kept making these offers through me and, in fact, others that, look, we'll be your best friend in the region, bar none. But what they did not understand was that the position in Washington was quite different. That any administration in Washington to establish a dialogue at that time with Saddam would have been, soundly criticized by the opposing political party, and in particular the Clinton administration had been weakened by the Monica Lewinsky affair and so forth. So they were not in a position to make those kinds of dialogues.
Was it sincere? Because people don't take Saddam Hussein at his word, didn't when he was alive and in power. Was there really counterterrorism cooperation that he was proposing in any sincere way? Wasn't he paying money to families of Palestinians who died in terrorist attacks? Didn't he have some oblique connection to the people who did the 1993 World Trade Center bombing?
He did, but I think the offer of a dialogue and an evolution of a relationship with the United States was genuine. All of these things were methods that he could derive leverage, which he could then give up. I think in retrospect, when you look at the costs of the war in Iraq and the cost of removing Saddam from power, many Iraqis after the war, people I knew very well from the regime, they said, why on earth did you have to go to war? Why couldn't you have gotten close to Saddam and then maneuvered him out? There were so many around him who would be happy to have seen him on his way out the door. So in retrospect, we look back and say, were there other tactics and approaches we could have pursued to solve the Saddam problem?
Former UN Chief Weapons Inspector Charles Duelfer, my guest on WNYC. His book, Hide and Seek, The Search for Truth in Iraq. He worked as CIA analyst, diplomat, other positions in Iraq for many years, including before the war. Another tidbit that will be new to our listeners. Before the war, you wrote up a list of people within Iraq who you had gotten to know who could help run Iraq after the invasion. And this list was instead used as a list of targets by U.S. forces?
Well, it was a missed opportunity. It's not that these some of the people who I knew and others knew in the regime who could have been very helpful to us in the transition when American forces got to Baghdad. Some of them were, inadvertently arrested or put on lists, blacklists, and so forth. But the larger point here is that, the administration elected to believe and use the information with respect to weapons of mass destruction from the intelligence community, which was largely wrong. That was not the most costly mistake, however. The more costly mistake, in my opinion, was a decision by the White House to not use CIA contacts and relationships with Iraqis inside Iraq who could have made a transition much more smooth, and we would not have had the ensuing 4 years of chaos. It's in my opinion, and my argument in this book, that had we made proper decisions in the fall of 2002 and early 2003, we would be where we are now in Iraq, but 4 years earlier, without the cost of billions of dollars, thousands of lives.